heading south for that first turnbuoy. With Norberto Ferretti not present at this event due to the destruction of his hull in Marbella, it would be left to some of the other high-tech boats to prove their speed. And fast it was across the start line as they gradually built up their performance. Giuffredi and Paul Picot was ahead at the start, and on board SDA with Eduardo Poli, we could see just how difficult visibility was in these wet and murky conditions. The huge rooster tails being thrown out at the back of the boats as their massive power plants drove the metal and carbon fibre hulls across the surface of the sea. Richard Carr in number 69, surprisingly and amazingly competitive in his first full season in World Series racing. Round the first turn, the south mark of the course, and now slightly out to sea. Further away from us, Fassa Daiwa, driven by Aliardo Dall'Olia. 1990 seeing him first really becoming competitive in Class 1 racing, 1992 seeing him maintain that competitive nature. Palchetti was here as well, and his speed building up until he overtook Fassa Daiwa. In the only monohull in this year's championship, Ove Ugland was having a race all of his own, in seas not best suited to a monohull. The conditions were far too calm, but they were well suited to Dalla Carbonara. Domenico Achilli was having a magnificent race and was holding second place. Behind him, Steve Curtis and Leonardo Poli. Paul Picot was leading the race, unaware that Renato Molinari was charging hard in number 15 up through the pack. Curtis knew he had the advantage on the Lamborghini-powered boat of Carr. Paul and Shark, powered by the only French Baudouin engines, was also doing tremendously well. The Mercruiser was becoming more competitive in B&B Italia, and they were being pressed hard by Giulio Boffi in Fratelli Rossetti. As Grunland came into sight through the murk, shadowed by Andreas Ugland, suddenly San Benedetto, driven by Damiano Spelter, pulled off the course, a huge plume of spray indicating that perhaps a drive problem had afflicted them. Steve Curtis, however, pushed on, back out to sea once more, into the gloom and the murk in his Cougar hull. Ahead of him in the distance, Domenico Achilli, just in sight, and Achilli had sight of the leader, Paul Picot. And Paul Picot's throttleman, Antonio Giuffredi, had had his mechanics working all night to tune the C-Tech diesels ready for this racecourse. Domenico Achilli has some of the most highly tuned Lamborghini engines in his Stain hull. The canopy has been modified again in 1992. Antonio Giuffredi, racing this year with Carlo Bonomi at the wheel, has changed his driver. 1990 saw him winning in Guernsey, but with the Italian tennis star Adriano Panatta. Three races into the championship, and Marco Capoferri's performance in the skater hull begins to improve. But Giuffredi's performance was absolutely blistering. Close behind now was Domenico Achilli, and closing on Achilli was Steve Curtis. Renato Molinari was having one of his best runs of the championship. Richard Carr had Molinari in his sights. Giuffredi had the Paul Picot trimaran perfectly trimmed. The three C-Tech diesels, designed by Fabio Buzzi, performing absolutely faultlessly here, and outperforming the high-speed Lamborghini-powered Stain hull of Domenico Achilli. The high and narrow tunnel of the skater hull, driven by Capoferri, seemed well suited to these conditions. He was outperforming Dalla Carbonara, a normally tremendously fast boat. The broader catamarans were suffering in the rough conditions as Giulio Boffi crossed the start-finish line. The race was over. Paul Picot had won, a clear advantage to a well-prepared boat. But as he opened his hatch and headed for the harbour, he was unaware of the battle that had been going on behind, for Achilli Motors had slowed just before the start-finish line, allowing the Cougar hull of Steve Curtis through. For Giuffredi, it was celebration time as they entered the port. Giuffredi had set an average speed higher than that ever achieved on a European circuit, 107 miles per hour, out on the open sea. Steve Curtis had just managed to squeeze by with a second place and was clearly delighted. Next door to him, the disappointment on Domenico Achille's face was there for all to see. He'd been cheated of second place at the last moment. A loss of oil pressure causing him to slow. In the background, the fifth place boat, Paul and Shark, performing extremely well with the French Baudouin engines. And at last, the performance beginning to come for Renato Molinari with a fourth place here in Pescara.